So today we're talking about autonomy, and and here are the definitions that people are reading them now. Is there anything that's missing from these definitions, or in these definitions that is present and surprising, or is this exactly what we expected?
I feel like Cambridge is like pretty much what I envision autonomy as. Like pretty hit the nail on the head.
All right.
I don't know if something about the Webster one is just not sitting as well with me, where I agree that like Cambridge just seems more concise and on point versus, I don't know, Webster just feels really broad and like it's kind of missing the mark somehow. I'm not sure what it is specifically, but something's just not sitting right with that one.
I feel like with Merriam-Webster, especially the first definition, I don't know if this sound. I feel like it's putting too much weight on the like individual relative to others, like existing or acting separately from others, versus I see it more as being like it's more active than that. You know, with Cambridge, it's making your own decisions, but with Merriam-Webster, it's existing separately from others. So I don't know. It feels more passive and more of like it's more dependent on third parties, you know?
It almost sounds like they're being negative about it with Webster versus with Cambridge. Like there's a slight, especially with like the first one, a little bit with the second one, but definitely for the first one, that it seems like there's a little bit more of like negative bias towards it. And it might just be the phrasing of it. I think that's what I don't like about it, or that's what's not sitting well.
Yeah, the one thing that I do like, maybe I don't know if like's the right word. I keep like coming back to the word existing in the Merriam-Webster definition. And I wonder, like, without getting into the philosophical debates of what does it mean to exist, and what does that look like for each person. But I find myself coming back to that word just because when I think of autonomy, I think of laws, things that exist that take away from the existence or the humanity in others, and how that is also a part of losing autonomy as well. And so I think I like the concept of I get to exist freely from others without some form of control. I'm rumbling with it.
I struggle with the concept of autonomy in general, so that's a whole separate deal. So and to go, I'm going to give a short. Just look at me bored if this is not running along things that you feel like you care about. But one of the things that I'm paying attention to is how people are inherently relational, from birth to death. In fact, a lot of research suggests that people are relational prior to being individual. In order to be individual, one must first be in relationship. And when we're born, we're inherently dependent upon our parents or our caregivers. And so we, like, by nature, we are dependent and therefore relational. And then the sense of self develops. And it's interesting because like our sense of self and who we are develops based off how we're taught. So when our parents are like babbling and giving us baby speak, they're teaching us how to learn language and use language. And so our whole mode of being is dependent upon another person. And in a way, that means that who I am is inherently tied to how I was raised and who I was raised by. And therefore, how is that not in a way being controlled by the people who have had an effect and that I've been in relationship with, right? And so there's a moment where I have the capacity to make a decision right now, but I have no control over how I was raised, how I am in existence with other people. And so, yes, I have the concept of autonomy right now where I can pick up this glass or not in that way, or to engage with you all or not. But in the same way, like who I am and my mode of being is entirely dependent and controlled by how I was raised and how I am in relationship with people now. And so I'm interested in how separate one person can truly be from another, which is where in the state of existing or acting separately from others doesn't seem entirely possible. Whereas the ability to make our own decisions without being controlled by anyone else seems somewhat more possible, still somewhat problematic. And so I think that's my problem with Webster, is that I don't think that first definition is literally possible. Great. Hearing no response, I'm going to go into these quotes. I will make them larger for us. Same deal. Like, as you read them, let us know if you have anything particular comes up for us, or not.
I think the first and third really resonate with me, especially considering how I view this episode, which I guess we'll get to in a little bit. But I think for the first one, I think of Bado and his character, and for the third one, I think of Aang and his journey through this episode. I don't know how much detail I should go into it now versus later, but I'll just leave it at that for now.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that. I see 2 as Aang's journey, and so I'll be excited to kind of talk through that. I agree. I think 3 is to the point, and I think it's at the heart of autonomy, especially through this episode. And I think that, yeah, those were the ones I like. But I also liked 4. These are great quotes, Ben. Thanks, bud.
We aim to please. I also love anything Atul Gawande has written. I haven't read all of it, but I've read a lot, and it's quite lovely.
Is it ironic that The Road Less Traveled has got to be one of the most read poems or works of all time?
I like how in the 4th quote, it talks about us asking and to be allowed to be the writers of our own story. There's something in that phrasing which is very poetic and beautiful, but also at the same time, not always the case, right? Because depending on what your circumstances are that you're in, you can still make decisions, yes, but sometimes it's like a whole chapter, you're like, what just happened? And I feel like we could talk about that later too, but that might be kind of what Bato is feeling with being left behind too, because of his injuries, which he wants to be with his, tribe mates, and he wants to be with his platoon because they're being soldiers together, but because he was injured, he had to stay behind to protect them, which yes, he's writing his story, but I think, and they talk about that too, and we can talk about it later, but I think that's also sometimes to be the writer of your own story, there's a lot of heartbreak in that, and there's other parts where you're not really the writer, you're more of the bystander or the reader for parts of it.
Yeah, and I know this was last month's discussion, but that also really makes me think of the whole discussion with the fortune teller, where it's do you let someone else dictate what happens in your life versus taking a more active role in trying to shape that path and be the writer of that story.
Speaking of last month, y'all will be pleased that tomorrow's premiere episode of The Legend of Korra does in fact feature Adam Sandler. And I did catch it. So I just want y'all to know that he didn't get away with getting it under my radar. I caught the reference.
It was a very blatant and non-hidden. It's
That's because you forgot till the end and you know it.
I literally said something along the lines of, it's like that Adam Sandler movie. Like, it wasn't something to be caught.
No. You'll have to listen to figure out what reference it was, though. It is very blatant, to be fair. He said he was going to try and hide it, but he failed miserably. Anyway, here we are.
Or was that the red herring that you thought that was the only reference?
You don't get to claim ones where you listen back and they're like there, but you didn't actually mean it. You need to mean it. None of that.
You have no idea whether or not I meant it when I said it in the episode.
I know for sure. I'm sensing that we're done with quotes. All right. Excuse me. Bato and the Water Tribe through a lens of autonomy. What came up for all of you?
Well, I just want to say that of all the episodes of this show, historically, this has been the hardest one to rewatch, and not because of like a particular moment at the end with Iroh and June, because I actually did not catch that until you guys brought it up on the podcast, which especially when I rewatch now, is very uncomfortable. But for me, a lot of it was because of what Aang goes through, because I have always been the kind of person that's very prone to personalizing other people's actions and creating, an idea of my sense of self that is very, it's very sensitive to how other people perceive me. And I feel like I could really empathize with Aang's character, but at the same time was incredibly frustrated with the actions he took. That moment where he takes the scroll and then crumples it up.
Yeah.
Every time I watch it, I'm like, oh no. And even if I know it's coming, it's still like I hate watching it so much. And so, I will say that like going through the podcast the first time, this was the episode where I was like, oh, this podcast is like really, really good. That was the moment I was like, oh my God. Like it felt like it like unlocked my understanding of why this episode gave me so much discomfort, because I could never really pinpoint why before that.
Man, that makes me want to delete episodes 1 through 14, re-record them.
No, I mean it's not a dig at those. It's just because like this episode was such like a specific pain point for me.
Oh yeah,
that I was like in going through episodes 1 through 14, because of how you guys were handling the show, I was definitely looking forward to this episode, and it did not disappoint at all. So,
wow, yeah, no, this is an incredibly uncomfortable episode for me as well, and I think for a lot of the same reasons that you're naming, is that I really empathize with Aang. And I feel it to my core. And what I love about it is that I'm also deeply reminded of how old Aang is when I watch this episode and Aang's age. And I think about all the times where like I wouldn't act that way now, like at least like literally in that situation. but I know that I would have in my past, or I would have done something similar where I would have covered the tracks with my airbending, and I would have done X, Y, like all of these things that Aang does in an attempt to belong, right? Because he feels like he's losing the only family he has. And like, it's tragic. It makes me want to, I'm tearing. Oh, it's really tragic because like, these are the things that this is all he has to hold on to in this new world that he's in. And I really have a hard time blaming Aang for any of his actions. I really struggle with, like, yeah, he does a lot of bad things, and I really just can't blame him. I get it, and that makes it really struggle. That's a struggle bus there, right? Yeah. So
it's almost like the perfect example of, you can have empathy for people, but that doesn't mean that that doesn't make their actions correct. Then we see that so frequently, like, oh, I understand why every character does what they do in this episode. And I understand why Sokka and Katara miss cues from Aang, that like he's making bids for connection, because they are so enthralled with being a part of family again, and seeing familiar faces and being back in the culture. I understand why Aang makes the decisions he does, because he's afraid of losing the family that he's kind of already created, and feels like he's losing that aspect of things. The extortion that like Zuko takes this necklace and uses it as a way to get what he wants out of situations is, you understand when you put that in the concept of his search for family as well. But every single one of those moments, I just like cringe on every aspect based off of the decisions that are made. Because the question that kind of comes to me in this mind for Aang is that specifically, does withholding that information by not giving something to someone who it's for, who it technically belongs to, takes away the autonomy from their ability to make decisions and move forward in their life, which is just absolutely not his place to be able to do that. It's also really nice that he finds like the resolution in 10 minutes of like that behavior. I don't think we work that fast. But it's tough to watch. It's super hard but it does kind of bring to light that, yes, withholding information, even though that he may not be physically restraining them or have policies in place that are restraining them or governing them into a way that like keeps them from having autonomy, just the act of withholding something that they don't even know they've lost is still creating that sense of an inability to make their own decisions. And I think that's like, that's just something that like we don't even think about when we think of autonomy a lot.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I think that's what really makes me think of the third quote. If do you mind, scrolling up, please. Thank you. It's because like he's essentially taking the choice away from Katara and Sokka. And so in his mind, he's created this scenario where Katara and Sokka will always choose their father over Aang.
Mm-hmm.
And by taking away their ability to make that choice, he is basically like setting in stone that perception, because like that's the only thing that can exist without giving them the choice, if that makes sense.
Well, and on the exact other side of that coin, I feel like is the argument and the lesson around having the autonomy to kind of stand up for yourself, or to voice your fears, or to lift up things that are concerning to you, or even saying that like, hey, I know that this is a terrible first draft in my head, and I know that this is the story I'm creating, but this is how I'm feeling. I think it's a lesson for us to do those things in those types of situations as well. Now, granted, there's always a slew of reasons around personal safety, physical safety, mental safety that also like has to come into that decision-making process when we kind of make those decisions to take that autonomy. But, the ability to sit there and lift those things up, I think you have to kind of make that choice, and you have to say, I'm going to write this part of my story because it needs to be discussed, or else it's not going to get fixed.
Mm. This is reminding me of relationships, the common like relationship trope where it's like, I can't let you be with me because of all these reasons. But really, what you're doing is you're removing the other person's autonomy to choose to be with you despite the danger. It's a common superhero love trope, right? Where like, Peter Parker's like, no, I can't tell you all the things that are going wrong because if I do, you're gonna blah blah blah. Like, isn't that my choice to determine whether I stay with you after I learn all these things? And what we're doing is we often just remove the autonomy from people when we don't give people that option, which it's tough because a lot of people are like, no, they shouldn't. You don't put that responsibility on them. They don't really know what they're doing. And then it's like, oh, but wait, okay, but I'm a person. Let me make the choice. So yeah, I struggle with that. It's just reminding me of that as a conversation.
I think this episode does a fantastic job of showing us like the worst side of our beloved characters. You know what I mean? Like it puts us in the dark with all of them. Like not just one of them, like because you can feel where Aang is coming from, but you can, like you said, you can also be really upset with Aang and his choices. And at the same time, we can look at Sokka and Katara and go, you missed the cues from Aang and him trying to be a part of this when his culture is literally annihilated by genocide. Like he needs to feel included. And then there's so many moments, but then at the same time you can relate to Sokka and Katara because they've literally not seen their father for years, and this is like the closest thing they have to like knowing that their dad is alive, even like because they didn't know really up to this point that for sure that their dad was alive. So it's really interesting to have, and I think that's where the discomfort comes from, or at least part of it is like we're sitting in the dark, right, with all of our favorite characters, and we're just going, wow, this really sucks. Like I don't like this.
And that's why I really love that the resolution, at least with Sokka and Katara, is when they hear the wolf, is Sokka basically drawing a direct comparison between him and Aang.
Yeah.
And him and Katara leaving Aang is very similar to how he felt when, his father and the entire Southern Water Tribe army left. It's that same kind of isolation and everything. So I feel like drawing that connection at the end really helps like sort of create that mend and bring the characters out of the dark.
I'm kind of kicking myself for not using this episode more in the Gifts of Imperfection series. Like clearly there's like so many like ways that I could have used it, and I'm like, oh no, it's over already. But yeah, there's just so much like there's so much in here that really just fits right into all of that, and I missed it probably because I was blocking it all out because it's so uncomfortable. But that's how that works. Man. Other moments of autonomy or lack thereof in this episode?
I will say I'm kind of gonna spoil my gratitude for this episode because it's probably gonna be Bado, unless someone else takes it first. Please don't. But I think Bado, even though he also kind of he misses the cues from Aang as well, I do think, and I give him a lot of credit at the end for when Katara and Sokka decide that they want to go find their father instead of going with Aang. He doesn't try and dissuade them. And I feel like that sounds weird, but I feel like especially after the trust exercise and things they had just done, he like firmly believes that these kids need to find their own path, and they need to build that trust with each other, and it can't be something that's, you know, encroached on by others. And when a moment like, you know, betraying that trust happens, they need to find that resolution themselves. And, you know, Bato does kind of push it along, because he points out that, you know, the lone wolf is crying out because he's been separated, and he feels the same way, and that kind of nudges Sokka along to his realization. He allows them to come to that conclusion on their own, and doesn't, you know, again, try and dissuade them.
Yeah. Well, and that's just like how much respect, and this goes for like every like elderly person who, like in all of the young adult novels, that is like, you know, you need to make the decision on your own. I can't help you. When, you know, it's always the people who are like, you should do this, that we don't like. And it's always the people like, this is a choice you have to make on your, and they were always like, I love them, they're so good, they're what a good mentor, right? And it's just like, that's just like that's the trope, and it's because that's what we long for. What we long for, and there's this sense of autonomy with blessing that matters, I think. And what I mean by that is like being able to make the choice in and of it, like is something that we must have and want and desire. But it's not just that. We also want the blessing of the people that we care about, the trust of the people that we yearn for acknowledgement from, that allows us to make those decisions, right? That's saying, when I make this decision, will you still love me? When I make this decision, just no matter what it is, like I might make the wrong decision. Are you still going to care? And that's what I think. And so that's what I've been kind of wrapping my head around, like this ritual of becoming a man in the water tribe, of like, you know, earning your marks in the water tribe and becoming an official water tribe member. And it seems like that's what this ritual does, is it creates this, you know, space in which what society is saying is that you're allowed to make your own decisions now, and we trust you. And I think that's really beautiful, right? And like prior to that, like before we recorded, and before, I guess we're recording now, before we took notes and thought about this, I was thinking like, this is dumb, I don't like this. And now I'm like, oh, that's kind of cool, I like it. So I'm reflecting on this ritual, and I'm finding it to be more beneficial than harmful in a way, with that as a lens. And I'm curious what are y'all's response to that? What are you thinking? I'm curious.
So I'm curious why you were you resistant to like accepting this ritual as like a coming of age type thing before?
I don't know how I feel about like coming of age rituals, period.
I see.
And also like more to the point, like now you're a man rituals, and the masculinity that is tied to it, and like, do all the girls go through this ritual, and how is gender in this, and what does that look like? And I just, that makes me feel icky. And so but that's not how I'm like, this kind of reframed it to not think about gender. But then of course it still becomes problematic when we re-invite gender into the conversation. So does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. And I think I definitely get that. I think part of the reason that didn't at first come to mind is because this is all based on like the context that Sokka grew up as being the only man or only boy in the Southern Water Tribe, because all the men left. And so there is this kind of like, there's already this separation where like the men would probably do this and the women someone else. But it's also because like Katara plays such like a large role in this rite of passage, and it is treated so casually. Like Bado doesn't make like a remark saying like, oh, typically like girls wouldn't be a part of this or anything. She's just like, you know, she's just part of the crew, just like Aang, just like Sokka, like they're all like part of it. So I don't know. I mean, I definitely get where you're coming from, but yeah, it's definitely something that didn't occur to me initially. So interesting.
I think there's a real beauty in the way that it's something that's very culturally significant to the Southern Water Tribe. And regardless, if not Katara being a female was supposed to participate, that she does. But then they also bring Aang, who is from a different culture, a different tribe, different religion, and he becomes a main part of that as well, but in a way where it's very respectful. You know what I mean? Where there's even hints earlier on in the episode where he's not being respectful because he didn't know that like the headdress was, you know, something that was sacred, and like the food is different. So I think it's very interesting how they really show how contrasting Aang's upbringing was compared to Sokka and Katara's, with just like their rituals, spiritual practices, and how he's kind of making errors because he's just not familiar with that culture. And I feel like being a white person, like that's so easy to do, right? Because we are so uncultured. But then this moment is just so inclusive in a way that it's like, this is how it should be, right? Like without being detrimental to the actual experience. Do you know what I mean? Like it was just like a very beautiful moment of how do we create this moment for Sokka, because this is something that's special to him, and you can tell that he's upset that he never got to do this.
Yeah.
And like making it happen still.
Yeah.
I also like this moment specifically through the lens of autonomy, because I think it highlights how powerful giving up autonomy can be, but also when you have the power to take it back. Like Aang, Katara, they had the choice to listen to Sokka through all of this. At any given point, they could have taken that autonomy back for themselves, but because of their trust, because of their relationship, because of the bonds that they had, they were willing to kind of give up their autonomy in certain situations because they knew it was for the betterment of the group. And for like, and so, but there was power that they always had the ability to take that back, versus, hey, here's some of my autonomy, and then I never get to take that power back. It's a very different situation. And so I think that there's a story in there, a parable, if you will, that kind of speaks to that.
Yeah.
For your point specifically, Ben, I wonder if it's too, it's just, you know, one, asking the questions on all of our rituals, all of our practices, about what the benefit is, what the harm could cause. And I think that's no different with this. Like there's clearly some ways that maybe they can improve it. I think it feels nice. Like it feels a lot less rigid than like Master Paku, or right.
Yeah. Yes.
So if that's the traditional space where they allow for like different people to come in and it feels a lot less rigid and it flows to meet the needs of the situation, then like, cool.
All for it. Yeah.
If Bado was like, sorry, Katara, Aang, no,
Get out.
like he'd be like, let's read the room a little bit. Let's we have a 100-year war going on that I'd really like to help end.
But also, like, I hear you, and I know that I want to believe that Bato would have made this same decision if they were in the Southern Water Tribe and they weren't in the middle of a war and Sokka had just come of age. But I don't.
In which case does that, at this point, does that cause more harm than it does? Like, because of the context and in that situation, does that shift the positive and the harm that could be done and the benefit from it? Because these things don't happen in a vacuum. And so I think that kind of speaks to it as well. So I think this is a yes and. Like this is not a either or.
My way, the highway.
Calm down, you big spice baby.
Spice baby.
And
Spice baby.
you know, one thing that and this kind of goes into Korra territory as well, but one thing that I think about a lot with the Avatar universe is what exactly culture means. And like, I'm sure down the road there'll be like a whole episode that could be done on this. But especially when we get to Korra, where with Republic City, there's a lot more intersection of cultures, and we kind of see in the comics with the colonies, what does it mean to be the child of a firebender or a Fire Nation person and an Earth Nation or Earth Kingdom person? Like, what does that mean for your rituals and your beliefs? And and as you move forward, how does your identity shape you? Like, who do you have allegiance to? Do you need to have allegiance to any of the four nations? I think it's something that's really interesting to consider, especially since, Ben, you mentioned like, if this were peacetime and Sokka were of age, made the same decision. And I think that, it's a fair question, but at the same time, that isn't what happened. And they are in a war, and they do have to rely on people, like, regardless of gender, regardless of nationhood, regardless of background, because that's what the circumstances require. So it's interesting how these things develop, and I'm curious how they would continue to develop on like an individual and also like larger scope.
We talk a little bit about water tribe culture in episode 1 of Korra that's dropping tomorrow. So that's really interesting. A little interesting little hint for you.
That might be where the Adam Sandler reference is.
It also might not.
Just have to listen. Could be anywhere.
Yeah. Y'all can tell me next month whether you thought this was something that he reminded himself of at the very end and threw in, or whether it just came up naturally, Anyway, other moments of autonomy. Should we talk about the obvious one with Iroh and June / the Shearshu in general, with removing, like, with the ability to paralyze people? I mean, like, to put Iroh, like, you're right, Maggie. Like, it is the dark side of everybody. And this whole episode is like dark Iroh. Like, have you seen that meme going around recently of like dark Zuko? And like, this whole episode is dark Iroh. Like, it's just like, oh no, I'm so uncomfortable with everything that's coming out of your mouth, except for the one-liner to Aunt Wu, which is like, yay, like Iroh wisdom. Then the rest of it is surrounded by him laughing like inappropriately, and like, it's just like, yeah, I don't want to lift it up just for the sake of lifting it up, but if there is any discussion that is lifting up for us, or questions that those moments are lifting up for us?
I get so mad at this episode, and it's like, anger leads to the dark side, right? So I try to process it with like as much as I can. But for me specifically, if I like boil it down, losing my autonomy has got to be one of my biggest fears, right? Like, I don't ever want to be buried alive. I don't ever, like, going caving sounds terrible, because the thought of like being trapped in a space and unable to move is no thank you. I think of like losing my mental capability in the future is like a massive fear of mine. And again, that's just mental autonomy there and the ability to make my own decisions. That's something that I fear, all of those things. And I fear losing my autonomy as my biggest fear as a straight white male in America who is 6 feet tall and over 200 pounds. Like, it is so unlikely that I'm going to lose my physical autonomy. And it's one of my biggest fears. So knowing that and knowing that I'm actually not experiencing that regularly is terrifying for the people that are. And so this episode that makes so many jokes, not just Jun and Iroh, but even like paralyzed Sokka gets hit with wood and like all of these other things that absolutely infuriate me, because I think this episode did real harm. Like, I think this episode caused harm. And when I've seen the fandom speak about this episode and make light of these moments, I see that harm because I see it in the comments of the videos we posted and things like that. And so this episode has become even worse for me to watch recently because I know how so many people take it and run with it and make light of it. And again, that's I'm not even the one being affected by it. Like, I'm not the one who is experiencing this out in the real world. And so I think that's what makes me even more upset about it.
I was adding on that not only do they like comment on it, but the way that they comment on it is justifying their behavior and making and excusing their behavior in a way that is not like saying, hey, this is why they did that and it's like okay, but like, no, this is why they did that and it's okay because they did it. Like, why is that even a problem? And I'm sitting here going like, and so, like, there's so much around a lot of people not recognizing exactly what we're talking about. It's just people aren't recognizing the problematic nature of what's going on here. Yikes.
I can't even begin to imagine how someone could even like possibly justify Iroh's actions in this episode. And I don't even want to know. So I don't plan on reading any of those comments.
I think it does get into the fact that people don't want to feel shame over something that they laughed at or something they experienced when they were younger, or want to feel guilty about things that they enjoyed. Because I'm on the side of like, if you enjoy things, like, let people enjoy things unless those things cause harm. And I think that that's one that a lot of people have a tough time rumbling with. Oh, I thought this moment was funny. I still kind of think this moment is funny. I don't want to rumble with the fact that that could be harm inducing for other people. And I think, but the reality is that like, we have to name these things and we have to teach these things.
Yes.
Working with kids, it drives me up the wall when my parents who are grandparents try to force themselves, like, their grandkids to like into hugs and things like that. And it is, I hate it. Right. Like, and I've, nicely to parents, like have called them out, but it's the same deal when it's, counselors or youth staff that I'm working with who get upset because someone didn't give them a high five. Like, they're 8. Why are you mad that an 8-year-old didn't want to give you a high five? Like, let them be 8 and also respect that they didn't want to touch you. Like, cool. But when we start naming these things and even allowing kids to understand like consent, autonomy, their own choice, what they get to do with their body is up to them. I don't think we do it enough. And and so I think that's one of our biggest gaps. I don't even think I knew the word autonomy, like in any realistic form until like maybe 3 years ago did I start like putting together what it was and what it meant. And like, so we've got a giant gap in what that means for what we can teach to others. And so, yeah. Rant semi over. I don't know if I'll ever be done with this rant.
Any other moments before we move on? I also don't want to rush your processing.
I need to give gratitude at some point here to get myself back into a good mental space.
Yeah. Well, here we are. I think what's important for me to think about in this moment is just how integral this is to like really living in and reading into all of like our darkness, so to speak, and like we are all capable of everything that's happened this episode. I recently had a moment where I told Sunshine, I don't remember what I was watching, but I was watching an episode of something where I laughed at a joke and I immediately was like, oh, I shouldn't have laughed at that. And it was a gendered comment and I laughed, and then I was like, oh no, why did I laugh at that? And I was like, oh no, like, and it was like this whole existential crisis because I laughed. And then it's one of those, like, this is real and it's present and this is something that's still happening. And I am, susceptible to all of the things that society is susceptible to. And I'm grateful that I was able to catch that in that moment. But not all of us do, and not all of us have the wherewithal or the awareness or the understanding or even the interest in learning. So I'm grateful that we have this space as an active learning space that we can call attention to these things. So thanks for supporting that, because that's partly y'all and our other people that are supporting this. Any other moments that we want to call out before we dive into our intention setting and our gratitude?
No other moments, but yeah, I definitely have moments like that. And yeah, it is. I'm definitely grateful for those moments where if I say something, my friends may call me out on saying something, or if I I catch myself and hold myself accountable for something I may do so that I can avoid doing in the future. And, it's something that it's going to happen. And as long as you catch yourself and are able to learn from that experience and move forward, I think on the whole, even though it happened, it is like a good thing and you can learn from it.
Ben, will you scroll back up to the top for the Webster definition real quick?
Certainly.
So after we've had this discussion, now I'm kind of thinking that the existing or acting separately from others is the moment of autonomy where we say that's not okay. Or like that joke is not funny for this reason. Do you know what I mean? Where you start to set the path of, we're not going to go with this, what was status quo that shouldn't be status quo because it's detrimental to others or a group or someone, or it's not funny that they didn't have autonomy. You know what I mean? So like now that we've had this discussion, I like Webster's dictionary a little bit more in that specific reasoning, where you're trying to change the path of like self-autonomy, but also bringing to light to others of, hey, like checking other people, but also checking yourself, right? Like you laugh at something, or maybe you don't say something when you should have said something, right? Like in a situation where you just kind of let it go because you're tired, or you don't really want to have an argument with someone because they're not going to be open to it, regardless of how much you try to be like, hey, not trying to say you're absolutely wrong, but like you kind of are, but like let's talk about it. Like this is like a word you shouldn't use, or things like that, or like the way you describe someone is hurtful to them, even though you're joking. It's not funny and it shouldn't be. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I can think of so many moments where I've made those jokes and then been promptly called out for it, and then promptly were like defensive, but on the inside, like, you're right, but I didn't want to be called out for it. Yeah. Yikes. Oh, well, this wasn't intense at all. All right. We're talking about this week, or this month rather, we're talking about fire as our element of choice and autonomy. And we are putting those together to set an intention for our month around how we want to engage with what we've learned today in this conversation, and with what we already know and whatever this episode has taught us. So I invite us now to lift those things up and set those intentions so that we can hold one another accountable. And at the minimum of being like, hey, how's it going? You said this, what's up? But if anything, kind of just a point of integrity for ourselves to ask that very same question. How am I doing in this intent with this intention that I set for myself? So at your leisure, whoever would like to go first, thinking about fire and all the things that
I think it takes to create the autonomy of going against the grain and the way of calling people out and the way of lifting things up takes confidence. It takes a fieriness that has to exist there. It takes fire, right? You have to, that takes the little bit of fire to be able to stand up in those moments and to call out friends and loved ones, and even to do it with compassion and warmth is incredibly important in a lot of those moments. But calling them out, and my goal is to do that when I see those things happen, and when to have the fire inside to kind of let that be how I proceed in those moments. And so I think that's my focus moving forward.
I'm going to go off of what Sunshine just said too. And also, like, we need that a little bit of warmth to like have a conversation with people, but also sometimes we just need to burn a whole mindset down, right? Like it needs to, like we need to start all the way over. Like we need to burn everything down so that way fresh ideas can grow. And I think sometimes you have to fight fire with fire, but in the sense of you're trying to like eliminate all of the junk that is in the fire, that is currently on fire. You know what I mean? And I think sometimes it's really easy to just try to put like a little spark and be like, you know, what if we did this? Or like, what if we didn't use that term? And then kind of walk away from it versus being persistent and being like, this is really important to me, or this is important to the other people I care about. And even though that person's not here, you shouldn't use that terminology, because you never know like someone else's story, right? So like you say something that is a joke, but you're like hurting someone that's in the room with you and you're not even aware of it. Or like other people are being harmful. And I like watched that happen once this weekend. And I was like, y'all made a joke about someone else, even though you didn't know you were making fun of them because you didn't know that was a thing. And now they're hurt and upset, but they're not going to talk about it because you don't even know that's something that they're struggling with or they've experienced before. Mm. So it's like trying to be the fire for others who maybe don't have enough in them right now to be the fire for themselves. You know what I mean? Because they've been through so much. But then also like sometimes I'm in that situation where I'm like, I'm not going to fight that because I don't have enough energy, even though that like was negative towards me, but I don't even have the energy to deal with that. Right. So like, that's when I want someone else to fight the fire for me because I'm like out. Yeah, fuel. Thanks, Ben.
I'm trying to figure out the right thing to say because I think this is probably the most difficult one so far for me to think of something. This pairing, and you guys did such a good job so far that
it's pretty good, right?
This is feels like, well, damn, I wish I thought of that.
I can go if you want more time.
Please.
So I'm also a big fan of the Cassandra Clare and all of her books. So the, Mortal Instruments, the Infernal Devices, et cetera, the whole Shadow Hunter world. And I there's a moment, spoiler alert for those of you who are keenly interested, there's a moment where one of the main characters becomes adopts this form where like he is no longer aging and really struggling, but because his body was diseased and he was addicted to a drug that he needed to survive. And what ultimately heals him and burns away all of the things that are ailing him is heavenly fire. And I'm thinking about how sometimes fire burns and it's agonizing and it's ultimately healing. And it's this idea that, sometimes fire burns you and it hurts and it's painful and there's no good that's coming of it. And then there are sometimes where it's fire that is burning you and it hurts and it sucks, but you're coming out the other side completely fresh and renewed. And I think about what that looks like. And to me, this idea of, quote, heavenly fire is speaking truth and maintaining your integrity and saying these things that it's exactly what y'all are describing earlier, but it's this confidence of, I'm going to say this and I'm going to burn it down with heavenly fire because this is what's right? I'm not going to cut you down with malice or cruelty and that be the fire with which I burn you, but I'm going to burn you with this thing that's going to sting because it's real and because it's true. And so like, it's calling me to be a little bit more honest in my, and less forgiving in a way, like, and I am very anti-confrontational. And when I see someone on the bus not wearing their mask the right way, I'm like, and then I like, should I say anything? Should I say something? And then I twitch the whole 20 minutes that I'm on the bus. And I'm like, should I have said something? And then I didn't say something. And then I agonize over it. I'm like, no, put on your goddamn mask. Excuse my language. And so, so it's just one of those things where like that's the things that I want to say that are like, think about like, I'm so concerned with my own personal comfort, and I'm being called in this moment to like, no, like stop it, call that shit out. And it's not just that, but like all the things, right? All the things that need a cleanse, so to speak. So speak truth to bullshit is my intention.
Okay. I think I know what I want to say. And it's taking a somewhat different approach than what you guys took. But I think that my devotion is going to be centered around creating boundaries, which is something that I generally struggle with, especially when it comes to family. And, as we get into the holidays, you're going to be seeing a lot more family. And as some of you maybe could understand, some family members have a habit of pushing boundaries past their limit. And I think that I would like to be very steadfast and strong in upholding those boundaries and not being afraid to be more confrontational or fiery if necessary. Because, at this point, because a lot of these boundaries were developed because, being like being the youngest person in my generation, in my immediate family, a lot of those boundaries were formed kind of, they weren't very strong. But now that, I'm an adult interacting with other adults, I have the right to put my foot down, and, I should be utilizing that right.
Yeah. Put that foot down.
Exactly.
You know why they call me Dragon of the West?
Can you reenact the Iroh dragon breath again,
No.
please?
No, too late. We missed it. They can rewind if they want to
Yeah,
see.
yeah.
That's what I was about to
It's
say.
recorded.
It's recorded. It
It's
ain't
recorded.
going anywhere.
Yikes. Okay. Well, this has been fruitful. So glad we could talk about our intentions. Let's move on to gratitude and share with whom, if any, we have been grateful. That was a terrible sentence. Pardon me. Feel free to tell us who you are grateful for from this episode, whether you have mentioned it prior to now or not.
You guys already know is Bado. Yeah, I mean, yeah, I did mention it before, but yeah, how he creates the space for autonomy for Katara and Sokka to go forward and, you know, figure out for themselves where their path lies and, you know, what direction that they want to take, especially after Aang kind of betrays their trust and they're hurt by it.
Love it.
I'm grateful for Sokka and him choosing the fate of the world over what he wants, right? Because that's kind of what he was facing. Go be with your dad or go help the Avatar, which is going to, in fact, hopefully ensure that future generations have a world to spend with their family and their fathers and not be separated by war, especially when he was able to empathize with what Aang was feeling with that lone wolf moment. I just think that was it was like such a glimpse of what future Sokka can be, right? Because Sokka in book one, we're just like, we're so cringy sometimes. Grow up a little bit, right? And then it's like that moment where you're like, okay, he has potential to be such a great leader.
Yeah.
And like that is one of my favorite moments of Sokka from book one, because we see what he's capable of, and then we get to see that in book three. We really get to see that in book three, and I think this is like the first glimpse of like who Sokka is becoming and like what he's going to be able to be in this world, versus like the first couple episodes you're like, wow, you're really annoying, especially as a female watching the show. As a kid, I was already irritated at him, you know, being a 12-year-old girl and him picking on his sister all the time, or like picking on the Kyoshi warriors. And I was like, that's so rude. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm gonna go with Madam Superior. She does exactly what we've been talking about. She calls out Aang, right? Like it seems little, but I think it's a moment where she says, "This isn't okay. You need to not do it. How dare you litter right here?" Like, and it's so small, but I like that moment, and I like that character. And I also like finding gratitude in the supporting cast.
Yeah.
And also, like, gratitude for Miyuki, the cat, getting blamed for, like, immediately the herbalist was like, was it Miyuki? And Miyuki's just like, what?
Was it Miyuki again? She's done it before. She'll do it again. Miyuki says a cab.
Yeah, that's right. I'm all about it.
You won't design a shirt that has that.
Miyuki says a cab.
Miyuki with a quote bubble. I'd wear the shit out of that. Oh, it's too much. Oh, wow. Let's make that for the merch store. Okay.
A shirt for grown-ups.
Yeah. I'd rock it. Anyway. Oh, wow. So like part of me is like really grateful for Aang. Part of me is grateful for June. Like I'm trying to think of like these all these various characters have like, oh, but this is important and I want to be grateful for this moment. And I think I'm landing on Aang is what's speaking to me most, but like I'm also just grateful for all these characters that are denied their autonomy and they do fine and they do okay. And June is not one of those, but I'm just lifting that up. It's there, and I'm going back to Aang, because this moment where there's a moment where it's the picture I chose for this on the Patreon. I don't know if y'all saw it or not, but the picture that I chose for the live episode for this episode is Aang sitting off to the side in the Water Tribe tent, and the other three are just like going to town on nostalgia. And I know what it's like to be the outcast in that group and to not know how to insert myself, or even like really to want to, because there's this like conflicting thing where you want them to be happy because they're the ones you care about, but at the same time you're like alone without them. And I just am really grateful for Aang and his ability to kind of teach us when it's important, like when does that integrity, where was it crossing the line for him? And it was when he had to look them in the eye and say, this is not something I can accept, because I've crossed that boundary before and I've said thank you and moved on when I should have said I can't accept this. And so I'm grateful for Aang for having that boundary at least.
I did really quick want to touch on Maggie's point because, growing up as a brown boy watching the show, one of the first characters I connected with was Sokka. And especially since I have an older sister, where like there was a lot of sibling tension, he was a very easy character for me to connect with. So I really appreciate your perspective growing up where you were more critical of him, because I think it's something that like I don't think about as much. So, being able to hear someone else's perspective of the same character is really cool.
Thank you. But then at the same time, it's good for me to hear that, he brought light to your childhood too, right? Even though I was frustrated with him. And isn't that the beauty of the show, that the characters are so realistic that there's light in them, but there's also dark, and we have to appreciate their flaws because their flaws are who create them, right? Like their flaws are their strengths sometimes, but then other times they need to overcome their flaws to be better, or to be the better version of themselves or their favorite self.
Yeah, so I didn't expect to tear up like 2 or 3 times during this conversation, but here we are. Thank you all for inviting me into the emotion zone. It's been great.
Lots of emoting today. We emoted so much.
Yeah. This is where I kind of invite us. Is there anything else for the good of the order?
Not at this time.
Not at this time. All right. Well, cool. If that is the case, then I will stop my share. And for everybody who's watching not in real time, until next time, be well and do good. Bye-bye.